All right, so ready to dive into a story where, well, charisma and controversy, they kind of crash right into each other.
Sounds intriguing.
It is. It is. Today's subject, Steven Donziger. Now, he is the lawyer who went head-to-head with Chevron over, well, massive oil pollution in the Ecuadorian Amazon.
Ah, yes. The case that made headlines everywhere. Didn't he win a historic settlement?
He did. But then things took a turn, ended up in some serious legal trouble himself.
So that's the big question, right? Is this guy a hero who stood up for the little guy or a mastermind who, well, maybe played the system a bit too well?
Exactly. And to figure that out, we've got a ton of sources, news articles, court documents, even some of Donziger's own writings. It's going to be a deep dive.
A deep dive indeed. And I think to truly understand Donziger, we have to first grasp the sheer scale of the environmental disaster he was fighting against. We're talking about the Ecuadorian Amazon back in the 1960s. Texaco was there drilling for oil, and they weren't exactly known for their environmental sensitivity.
Texaco, they later merged with Chevron.
Right. Right. And the environmental damage. Catastrophic. We're talking about billions of gallons of toxic wastewater just dumped straight into the rainforest ecosystem.
Billions. I mean, is that even, how do you even comprehend a number that big?
It's almost impossible. Think about it. Oil-slicked roads, pools of crude oil just sitting there in the jungle, rivers so polluted they were basically unusable.
Just wow. I mean, what about the people living there? What kind of impact did this have on them?
Devastating, absolutely devastating, especially for the indigenous communities, the Kofan people. They relied on the rainforest for everything, their food, their water, their way of life.
And those sources, they mentioned a Kofan leader, Emergildo Criollo. He actually lost his second child to oil-contaminated water.
Criollo's story is, well, it's heartbreaking. He saw his community's way of life just destroyed, their land poisoned, their health, their future, all because of the pollution.
So into this nightmare walks Steven Donziger, fresh out of Harvard Law, ready to take on the world. It's 1993 when he joins the legal team representing 30,000 Ecuadorians in this huge class action lawsuit against Texaco.
And from the get-go, Donziger, he makes it clear he's not backing down, he's not intimidated. In fact, he wrote later, quote, I simply agreed to seek a remedy for 30,000 victims for the destruction of their lands and water, to seek care for the health impacts, including birth defects, leukemia, and other cancers, and to help them restore their Amazon ecosystem and basic dignity.
Wow, strong words. But lawsuits like this, they can drag on for years, decades even. How did they even afford to keep fighting?
Donziger, he got creative. He started selling shares to investors, promising them a big payout if they won the case. High risk, high reward. But it kept them going.
And after almost 20 years of legal battles, they did win. Big time. 2011, the Ecuadorian court rules in favor of the plaintiffs, awards them a record-breaking $18 billion in damages, later reduced to $9.5 billion, but still.
A monumental win for Donziger and, of course, for the Ecuadorians. It was like David had actually slain Goliath.
But Chevron, they weren't just going to accept defeat quietly.
Oh, no, not at all. They came out swinging, claiming the judgment was obtained through fraud and bribery, and they pointed the finger straight at Donziger.
Fraud, bribery. Those are some serious accusations.
They were. And to make sure they didn't have to pay a dime, Chevron moved their assets out of Ecuador, made it impossible to enforce the ruling there.
So what did Donziger do? I mean, what was his next move?
He tried to enforce the judgment in other countries where Chevron had assets. But Chevron, they were already planning their counterattack. And they were taking the fight to Donziger's home turf U.S. courts.
Bringing the battle to him, huh?
Exactly. In 2011, they filed a RACO lawsuit against Donziger in the U.S. That's the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, usually used to target, organized crime. They accused him of racketeering, bribery, even ghostwriting the Ecuadorian judgment.
So they were basically trying to portray him as some kind of criminal mastermind?
That's exactly right. Their goal: completely discredit Donziger, undermine that Ecuadorian judgment. The stakes were incredibly high, not just for Chevron and Donziger, but for those 30,000 Ecuadorians who were still waiting for justice.
High-stakes legal showdown. And it all came down to one man, U.S. District Judge Louis A. Kaplan. He was known for being tough, especially on corporate crime.
Kaplan, he was a key figure in this whole saga, and in 2014, he ruled in favor of Chevron, blocked the Ecuadorian judgment from being enforced in the U.S. It was a devastating blow for Donziger and the Ecuadorians.
What did Judge Kaplan actually say about Donziger?
He didn't hold back. He accused Donziger of egregious fraud, said he was a manipulator who had coerced the Ecuadorian court. It was a scathing indictment of Donziger's tactics and his ethics.
So what was the evidence? What did Kaplan base his ruling on? And how did Donziger respond?
One of the key pieces of evidence was testimony from Alberto Guerra. He was a former Ecuadorian judge, and he claimed that Donziger had bribed him to rule in favor of the plaintiffs. Donziger, though, he denied it all, vehemently. Said Guerra was a paid witness for Chevron, that his testimony was completely fabricated. He appealed Kaplan's ruling, of course, but higher courts upheld it.
Things were escalating fast.
They were. And then Donziger refused to turn over his personal devices, phone, computer, you name it. He cited attorney-client privilege, and that led to a brand new charge. Criminal contempt of court.
They went after him for not cooperating.
Yep. And get this. To prosecute the contempt case against Donziger, Judge Kaplan appointed a private law firm, a firm with ties to Chevron.
Wait a minute. A private law firm connected to Chevron? How is that even allowed?
A lot of legal experts cried foul. They said it just didn't look impartial. Even a UN panel later found what they called staggering bias against Donziger in the U.S. legal proceedings. It was a huge boost for those who saw Donziger as a victim of corporate bullying.
But despite all that, the case against Donziger, it kept moving forward.
It did. And in 2019, he was found guilty of 6 misdemeanor counts of criminal contempt of court. And that set the stage for a battle over his sentencing.
So Donziger, the lawyer who wins this massive judgment against Chevron, ends up facing criminal charges himself. Talk about a twist. What happened with his sentencing?
Well, in 2021, after years of legal battles, even house arrest, he was sentenced to 6 months in prison for criminal contempt of court.
6 months in prison, just for not turning over his devices. Seems, I don't know, a little extreme.
Donziger's supporters, yeah, they thought so too. They argued that it was basically a way to silence him, send a message to anyone else thinking about challenging, a huge corporation like Chevron.
This story, it was all over the news at this point, right?
Yeah.
Worldwide. What was the reaction?
Outrage, protests, you had human rights organizations, environmental activists, even celebrities like Roger Waters, Bianca Jagger. They all rallied behind Donziger, calling for his release.
They were basically saying he was a political prisoner.
Exactly. They said he was being punished not for contempt of court, but for, daring to hold a powerful corporation accountable.
So did Donziger just serve his time quietly? Or did he keep fighting?
Oh, he was defiant. Even while he was confined to a halfway house in the Bronx wearing an ankle monitor, he was using social media, denouncing his imprisonment, calling it an outrage, vowing to keep fighting for justice.
It's kind of remarkable, his persistence. What kept him going? I mean, he was facing some pretty huge obstacles.
Well, Donziger always maintained that he was in prison because he was successful in challenging Chevron. He saw himself as a martyr for the cause of environmental justice. He refused to be silenced.
But let's step back for a second. Donziger refusing to comply with those court orders, even if he believed he was, acting on moral grounds, shouldn't there be some consequence for that? I mean, doesn't respect for the judicial system matter?
That's the question, isn't it? It's a complicated situation. You have to remember 2 sides to every story. His supporters saw him as a hero, standing up to corporate power. But his critics, they saw him as maybe a rogue lawyer, manipulating the system for his own gain. The truth, it's probably somewhere in between.
The punishment itself, it sounds like that became a point of contention. Did the punishment actually fit the crime?
Big debate about that. On one hand, some people said Donziger's actions, his defiance, it undermined the court's authority, and that deserves punishment. They say, we need a functioning legal system where everyone is held accountable.
And the other side, what did they say?
Donziger's supporters said the charges were excessive, politically motivated. They pointed to all the unusual stuff in the case. The private prosecutor with ties to Chevron, the UN panel's finding of bias. They said the system was rigged against him.
So Donziger was eventually released from prison, right? December 2021. But his legal battles, they didn't end there, did they?
Nope, not at all. He's still appealing that criminal contempt conviction, wants to clear his name, get his law license back.
What about the 30,000 Ecuadorians, the ones he was representing? What happened to their $9.5 billion judgment?
They're still waiting for justice. Chevron's refusing to pay. They say the judgment was fraudulent. And they've been pretty successful at blocking its enforcement in the U.S. and well, everywhere else.
So Donziger wins this huge victory in Ecuador. But Chevron, it seems like they've managed to just avoid any accountability.
It's a frustrating situation. Makes you wonder if the legal system, even when it seems like justice is served, can it really hold these huge corporations accountable for their actions?
Imagine living in a place where the water is poisoned. This wasn't just some legal battle. This was about real people, a devastated homeland. And they're still waiting for compensation for some kind of cleanup effort.
They're still fighting on multiple fronts. They've taken legal action in other countries where Chevron has assets. Canada, Brazil, Argentina. They haven't given up hope that one of these courts will finally make Chevron pay the damages.
And Donziger himself. He's still a vocal advocate for environmental justice. Despite all the legal setbacks, he's writing articles, giving interviews, using his platform to bring attention to the Ecuadorians, to speak out against corporate impunity.
Yeah, he's definitely not letting Chevron silence him.
Donziger's story, it's a real thriller. Environmental devastation, legal battles, corporate power plays, and this controversial figure right at the center of it all. We've looked at the accusations against him, the evidence, the arguments on both sides. It's complicated, no easy answers. But one thing's for sure. This case, it's had a huge impact on the fight for environmental justice.
Absolutely. It shows the challenges that people face when they try to hold these big corporations accountable for environmental damage.
It's kind of a reminder that winning in court, it's only half the battle, right? It's about whether justice is really, truly served. And in Donziger's case, even a landmark victory, it didn't seem to bring about the change that he and the Ecuadorians were fighting for.
Yeah, that's the big takeaway here, I think. Donziger's case shows the limitations of the legal system, especially when you're going up against these massive corporations with unlimited resources. It really is David versus Goliath. But even if David wins, he might not get the reward, you know?
It's got to be so disheartening for the Ecuadorians. They've been waiting for over 2 decades for justice, for compensation.
Yeah.
What does this whole case tell us about using legal strategies in environmental battles?
Well, Donziger's story, it shows that you need more than just lawsuits. Legal action, it's important, but you also need public awareness campaigns, political pressure, international solidarity. You have to build a movement that's too big to ignore.
Donziger himself, he's become a symbol, right? But people are still arguing about his tactics, his motivations. Is there a definitive answer? Is he a visionary? Or is he a con artist?
I think that's up to each person to decide. We've looked at all these sources, and they all have different perspectives on Donziger. Some say he's a crusader, others say he's, well, maybe not so sincere.
It's interesting, right? These high-stakes legal battles, they often turn into media wars. Corporations, they have the resources to shape public opinion, to try and influence the outcome. It becomes hard to separate the truth from the spin.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to be critical. Look at the information, think about the sources, and be aware of those biases. Donziger's story, it's a cautionary tale. In the fight for justice, things are rarely black and white.
So we've come to the end of our deep dive into the world of Steven Donziger. A lot to think about. What does this case say about holding corporations accountable for environmental damage? How do we make sure that profits don't come at the cost of human rights, of the health of our planet? And maybe the biggest question of all, in a world where charisma and controversy are so intertwined, how do we tell the real agents of change from the ones who are just really good at promoting themselves?
Those are questions we all need to be asking. Donziger's story, with all its ups and downs, it's a case study. It shows us how challenging, how complex it is to fight for justice, to hold the powerful accountable.
Thanks for joining us. We hope you keep exploring the sources, keep having those important conversations.